And I'm happy to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Timo Spinde, Media Bias Group and University of Göttingen, and Martin Wessel, Center for Digital Technology and Management, Technical University of Munich, presenting their work on automatically detecting media bias, interdisciplinary insights and advances. And now I would like to pass the mic to our speakers.
Well, thank you very much. So hello, everyone, also from our side. I'm Timo Spinde, and I started working on media bias about 5 years ago when I started doing my PhD research, which has by now concluded. In the process of doing the PhD, I tried to find other people motivated to work on media bias together and passionate about the topic. And this is how the concept of Media Bias Group was created, a network that brings together different researchers of media bias. And Martin is in this group. So Martin, before I start, maybe you will briefly want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, happily. Hello, everybody. I'm Martin. I at some point during my master thesis joined Timo on his quest of studying media bias. I'm currently pursuing my PhD at the Technical University of Munich. I'm also working, that's why the complicated name for the center before, in innovation and entrepreneurship education. So I'm basically doing both, but I'm also very happy to still continue working with Timo and with the Media Bias Group on media bias and all that comes with it.
Yeah, so today we are going to talk a little bit about the current state of research on automatically detecting media bias, about data sets and things that were created in our work so far, and also talk a little bit about the challenges that this domain brings with it. And of course, ideally, in the end, but also in between, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt or say something. Like both of us have been working in research the last years, but of course, we're all both quite kind of young. And if you are interested in doing a PhD or if you have questions about how to tackle this or these problems, then feel free to always reach out to us and talk to us. I think that's what a research network is for ultimately. Otherwise, let's look into it. So we're going to look first briefly into the motivation of researching media bias and the research gap. Then we will look at some research results that, in particular, like I did during my PhD thesis, but Martin, for example, also collaborated closely with some. Oh, I see a message in the chat. Oh yes, thank you. And so some of the classification approaches that are out there right now, which I think there's really a lot to discuss about, especially since GPT and other models came around. There are many questions that concern this whole area. And in the end, yeah, we will just conclude, discuss, and give a basic outlook. So, no. So let's jump into it. Media bias. Here you see just a short illustration of how differently you can portray different events. And while this is just one event, I would guess that, oh yeah, Martin, you feel free to answer the questions in the chat if they're like this. I think that most of you have some examples of media bias in mind already. If you read your local news, you talk to your friends, you read newspapers, even in physical form, maybe independent of where you intake information, there might be bias, and especially in the news, different opinions and political parties influence how information is portrayed, which information is selected, and this has a large impact on personal perception of topics. So here's another small example, which was very, very strict, very, very strong in 2015 after the refugee crisis. One newspaper in Germany was like, "Welcome to Germany, refugees will arrive in Munich." And another very, very right-wing news outlet posted, "Islam invades Germany," extremely strong. Obviously, most people would agree that this is completely inappropriate. It was posted publicly on a news outlet, and I think it's an illustration of how strong this can be. And just reading these two sentences, also emotions in probably most of us are created, where we try to align our cultural, social, and any other experience to what we have just consumed as information. Now, a short definition. Media bias is the perceived or real partiality of and favoritism of any medium. It can influence public or individual perception by emphasizing certain stories, perspectives, or facts over others. And basically, it expresses an opinion. One particular type of media bias that we look at a lot is media bias by word choice. We have started working on text back in the days, and I think our main expertise still lies in text media bias, whereas we are slowly, as a research network, taking on more funds to also make projects with other types and multi-modularity of media bias. But media bias by word choice is an asymmetry in the word choice itself, which reflects the social category cognition applied to any group or individual or any entity that's described in any content. And therefore, it can be non-neutral, polarizing word choice. And it's more about the style of what is said and less about the content, even though the content, of course, also plays a major role, which we are happy to discuss about in the end. Now, venturing into this domain, we had different motivations. First, of course, is this impact of this general problem on all of us. Like whether it's your dad, your mom, your friends, your brother, your anything, like your personal perception of politics, topics, gender discussions, income discussions, universities, like media bias is basically everywhere. And companies and researchers still mostly use manual evaluation to address these problems. This has started to change the last years, and for sure GPT shifted a lot of attention onto automatic classifications. But still, nowadays, we are in touch with a lot of newspapers, and many of them, they have some automated tools, but the highlight is semi-automated. And it's hard to automate a media bias analysis in general because it is very subjective. And however, if in an ideal, perfect world, we had a very good media bias automated analysis that people could trust, which says like a lot and makes a lot of claims and assumptions, like it would be a lot easier to increase bias awareness. And it's not by accident that in the last years, platforms such as All Sides, Ground News, or Ad Fontes have come up, which basically try to compare news from different platforms and basically try to combat this issue in showing you different perspectives, but they're still small. Now, this was before we started, but still some related work. There are not many literature reviews on media bias, which was a problem when we started. Most of the data sets were created through crowdsourcing, which even back then had quality issues and still has. Some of them were based on Wikipedia, which is, I guess, okay. And like back then were probably the best ones, but still has crowdsourcing issues. They were based on traditional linguistic features, basically trying to explain that the perception of a word is based on like its ending or derivative or something around the world, a word, or the frequency of appearance. But actually, media bias most likely can be a lot more complex than this, and is interpreted by a series of complex processes in us. And back then it was already clear that you can increase awareness if you inform people about bias. So I would say when we started, and this is one of the major things that we have put out so far, is that we found that media bias was always used as a single concept. Is it biased or not? And we started doing the same. Actually, like when I started the group by myself, I thought this was it. Like this is it, right? It's media bias. Media bias is media bias, and it's biased or it's not biased. But I had to find out, I would say the hard way, that this is not true, and that there are so many different kinds of media bias, such as linguistic bias, such as text level context bias, encompassing everything around the word or sentence in one text. Reporting level bias, which goes broader, is everything about a specific topic or just everything in general that is reported, that is covered. So it strongly contains a content perspective also. There is cognitive bias about who are we, what is our social experience, what is our education, what is our background, cultural experiences. And this has also a huge impact on what is bias, as have other related concepts such as hate speech, sentiment analysis, framing effects, group bias, racial bias, and others. And when we started, I would say, like, this is a small example where we see that that it is possible, if we just look at words on a lexical level and assess how strong they are, that we can identify media bias. Like the first sentence, which has quite strong wording in general, like snarky liberal bashing, blatant, disparate, must pay. This was already possible back then. But what wasn't possible is find something that is more subtle. And in most public cases, media bias is subtle. And the extremely strong wording is not so often used, and this is difficult to assess automatically. So single task and feature-based classifications failed there. Which leads us to the research gap that we found. No lack of overview, no literature review, no standard taxonomy, no standardized evaluation of how to ask for how someone perceives bias, limited data sets with not enough topics, with no annotations on different levels, with no information about who annotated, which is a big thing for media bias. It's subjective. Automated levels, which have low quality, and also sometimes there were data sets, but more about other topics and not so much about media bias, which also led to the general performance of the systems being poor, and the only research about creating awareness basically showed that if you increase awareness, but it wasn't very specific. So this is what we basically found and what we have been working towards too. None of these questions are, of course, terminately finished or answered, but we are trying to work towards understanding media bias better, with the main objective of like my PhD work being whether we can use all these different components. Like first, we have to understand the components, identify them, and then if we know this, can we actually use all this different knowledge about media bias and the different subconcepts to detect media bias better than before? And maybe is this a way to like build a reliable media bias classifier? So what we did, or what I particularly did in the PhD thesis, was first review and try to create a first taxonomy, with the research question being which kinds of media bias are algorithmically detectable and which methods achieve the highest performance. Then second, we were looking at the psychological aspect of it, because if we create classifiers and data sets, we need to have feedback. And if we don't know which impact the question or the topic at hand has on the response by a human, then it's going to be difficult. So we try to assess the influence of questions on whether or not or how much the question influences annotations or responses. We started creating data sets, which both Martin and me will say some things about today, and we try to investigate what good ways are to create media bias data sets, and then use language processing methods to build models, to like use basically the experience from the first three parts to create classifiers that are usable, evaluate them thoroughly on different data sets, and then finally also investigate whether these results can be used to indicate bias to news readers or to basically anyone, and try to learn about, well, what if we have this classification? Like, what are we going to do then? And like, how is this going to help? So this is the last part of it. For the presentation today, I will focus a little bit more on these three parts: the data sets, the NLP methods, and the evaluation. But of course, if you have any questions about the other things, I will mention them in one slide later on. But of course, feel free to ask questions or contact us afterwards. So let's get to it, to the data sets at first. The first data set that we created, I think I will tell this as a little bit of a story where like you can see how much research on the topic has changed. And in the beginning, crowdsourcing was like the way to go. GPT was unthinkable, like 2019, like, or it was, BERT hasn't even come out. So people were like, I don't like, crowdsourcing is the way, it's modern, it's the thing to go. So I went onto this approach and crowdsourced a data set where I asked the annotators for their characteristics and for education, age, political orientation, and so on. And then they annotated binary bias. Is it biased or not? Which at the time was still what we figured was right. And they did this, and the results were poor. The agreement was not great. It was difficult for people to understand what bias is. And basically this, which led us to believe that maybe it's not the best way to do it with crowdsourcers, because bias is so complicated. And like even all of us in this room, if we would see sufficient samples, we would not always be able to judge whether it's really biased or not. And it's not always, I mean, it depends on the definition for sure. But in all of the experiments, we saw that even people with significant background, sometimes based on the definitions that were the state of the art, struggled to identify whether it's biased or not. And since it is also subjective, there's not always an absolute truth. But the overlap was very low, so we thought we have to make it better, and we tried to train people. So over 6 months, we had regular training sessions with examples, discussions, and tried to get better in identifying media bias, and then created a new data set, which at least from our group, I guess, is somewhat of as like a first milestone that we had. The data set is very often downloaded, and it's a valuable resource, even though it has some downsides still. But it's basically expert annotated binary bias sentences. And then, like later on, we found out that while these expert annotations worked well, they focused only on binary bias. So we thought, well, aren't there other data sets like related to media bias that we could use? And so this was actually something that Martin did as a first author. So it's one of his major research contributions so far, creating a benchmark. It's like collecting data sets and tasks that relate to media bias, and then filtering them based on their quality and based on how related they are to media bias and some other details. Here's just a short illustration of differences between the data sets, the crowdsourced between the experts. While the crowdsourced says the sentence is not biased and only marked the word assaulted as biased, the expert said, well, claim is actually also biased because it casts doubt on the speaker. And in the BAPE data set, at least from our perspective, this was a little bit more accurate. And like it seemed that the experts had become more able to see especially slight examples of bias. And here's another example. Republican president tried to help, but he rejects climate science. And in MBIC, people thought this sentence was biased. And likely this was because of their personal stance towards climate science. But actually in BAPE, people said, well, actually, anyone can reject climate science. And if that is not my opinion, then that's fine. So I would say this sentence is not biased. And this illustrates a little bit how different annotations between the experts and just amateurs on crowdsource and MTurk, Prolific, these platforms could be. Going to the last part of it, the MBIP benchmark. So that was basically just a collection, as I said, not our own data set. We filtered for accessibility, for English language. We tried to find only data sets that have specific size. We inspected them manually. We looked at whether we can unify the label into one so that it's easier to use all of them for one single evaluation. And yeah, we tried to relate them to the tasks that you see here on the right, which were based on a taxonomy that we created before. I will say something about this in a bit, but basically we made a list of all the concepts that relate to media bias and then checked literature without end, lots of papers systematically, and tried to understand which concepts are out there and which might be the most relevant. So we tried to collect a first selection and then use this. Getting us to the second point, to the classifications. I'll go through this a little bit faster. So first, we also jumped on the train of building feature-based models, which the most successful model there was a traditional decision tree model, which had an okay performance, but wasn't very good. Then BERT came out and the BAPE data set. So we built a second classifier based on that. And we also pre-trained it additionally based on something that's called distant supervision, which basically means that you give weak labels to the classifier where you have a related label, but not exactly the label that you want. So we basically told the classifier, here are headlines from articles, and they are classified by their political ideology, left and right. And we assumed that more left or more right would automatically mean more bias. And we gave these weak labels to the classifier, which worked a lot better. We will see the performance in a second. And then we also did another experiment on multitask learning, which led to the currently state-of-the-art model that we put out, which in current experiments even beats GPT on like a binary bias evaluation just by a bit, but slightly. Yeah, this is basically a model that incorporates many tasks to finally classify whether something is biased or not. These are some of the features. I think looking at the time, I will skip this here. And the performance wasn't very good. It was around 0.5. The second model based on BERT was already a lot better, which of course is mainly due to the stronger model, which was around 0.8. And then we did, sorry for this, then we did another experiment, as I said, with many tasks, applying multitask learning. And we used 123 data sets, very different media bias tasks, some things like we mentioned before, linguistic bias, hate speech, gender bias, different data sets. And we used all of these together to create a model. And this was the so-called MAGPIE model, which has an F1 score of 0.84, which is what is currently like the state of the art on binary bias classification, which is a very niche task for sure. Here just a little overview. Well, all of those models have different advantages and disadvantages. But basically, features have the advantage that they're easy to explain, but they have a low performance. Then we used like the traditional pre-training, fine-tuning approach, and finally multitask learning, which in my opinion shows mainly one thing, and that's also one of the major takeaways. Media bias is complex, and it contains a lot of different aspects. And not for all of us, all of these aspects are equally easy to see. And the more we know about all of the different types of media bias and subconcepts, the better we will be able to build strong classifiers for all of the subconcepts. And this is what basically this experiment showed on one concept, on binary bias, and using all of those other things to work on it. Which brings me to like the contributions that were part of my PhD thesis, going back to like the research questions that we've seen before. And first, this is what I said before as well. There was a taxonomy published, which is still a project that is largely ongoing. But what we tried was to define it. So what is media bias? And like based on a systematic literature review, we concluded that it contains linguistic bias, text level context bias, cognitive bias, and reporting level bias, and some other related concepts. And we collected data sets, we made the NBIT benchmark based on this taxonomy, and are now using it to extend it also, because there's so much research about media bias, and the definitions are not unified, and it's difficult to overlook. Still, it's very important to know what it actually is and like what it consists of. Then the questionnaire, as I said, like we assessed these questions to understand bias, and we published a 40 item questionnaire measuring bias perception, basically reduced other questions. So we tried to find as many papers as possible that ask for bias. And then we collected all of their questions, and we tried to see whether they are similar. And we condensed similar questions to like a set. And in the end, we tested these in a study, trying to understand whether the question impacts the response. All right. Then, of course, this I already said, like we showed that for making data sets, experts are required, at least to some level, and people can get a lot better in understanding what bias is. Bigger data sets and multitask approach approaches, they perform better when classifying media bias, which likely could be the future of this whole domain. Give me a second. And and well, we also saw that humans are still likely better in identifying media bias if they have sufficient training than the models, but the performance on these tasks has improved strongly over the last 10 years. And like software and systems are now possible that haven't been possible before. And I think we are really just at the beginning of assessing where this takes us, because this is kind of an endless tornado of going between improving misinformation, controlling emotions, and understanding extremely well who my audience is so that I can really target it extremely well. And then at the same time, also the other side, like how do we improve awareness of media bias? How do we deal with this? How do we make sure that we are like less easy to manipulate, given that creating content automatically becomes easier and easier every day? And I think this much brings us to like the multitask methods. This I've said that we think that assessing the problem as a multitask problem is the way to go. And this way, this is just a small illustration. We can also identify a sentence like this more easily. And it's the same example as we've seen before. Which brings me to some discussion and outlook. Just some points to mention. I'm happy to discuss these with you later. I think it's quite a some remarks just in general. We saw that if we annotate bias, it is important to keep the raw data diverse and to be very aware of what we label. We see that there's a lot more effort required to decompose the task of media bias into simpler, solvable subtasks, which we've already started to do. We see that a lot of the research on this is for English, so at some point it will be very interesting to translate and to see how bias perception varies between countries. The data set sizes are still limited, so maybe LLMs can help to solve this gap, which is something that we are investigating because they do continuously improve. And for sure, GPT especially has had its impact on the domain. We saw that experts yield better labels than crowdsourced workers. Still, in some special cases, both might still be viable. And we also see that when understanding how media bias impacts our own decision making, we're really just at the beginning. Like, it's very difficult to assess this among cultures, among people, among education levels, societal levels, just anything. And since it has such a huge impact on our decision making, I think it's very fascinating to work on. I think this much about that. So now I will give the word to you, Martin.
All right. I thought you had the slides from me attached, but then I will
I
briefly
think I think I, I think I did. I don't know like what happened
No
here,
worries.
but maybe
No
it's
worries.
easier this way.
We can make a smooth transition. All right. So we thought that Timo basically talked a little bit about the past and how the field developed over the last years. And I wanted to use the remaining time to talk a little bit about an outlook and a little bit also about maybe the future, what are open fields, and use this opportunity to also touch upon a couple of projects that we're currently working on. So none of this is by any means complete. I'm sure that you will also find a lot more ideas on or where the field can and should investigate and what are things that are still to do. But I thought I'd touch upon five today. I think they all will not come as a surprise after hearing the developments by Timo. So I think one component that was already touched upon is obviously the data. That we see a lot of work that still needs to be done. I mean, ultimately, all these models, all the performance increases there heavily rely still on classified data that we have off bias. So be it that there's humans annotating it, maybe it's also LLMs that are overtaking annotation tasks. But at the end of the day, without labeled data, there is basically we will basically not see a lot of performance increase or also a lot of improve in that. It has a lot of challenges. I think Timo has already, when creating, talking about creating BAPE, has already touched upon these. So I think something that can be stressed here is that we especially see a lot of categories of bias where there is simply little to no data available. So these are just fields where the research has very much concentrated on a couple of aspects of media bias. For example, political bias, maybe also gender bias, but there's other kinds of biases that we might have not even defined yet, where there's very little data out there. So if we want to push these models forwards, we cannot circumnavigate also looking into increasing the data that is out there. I think definitions, Timo's also touched upon a little bit on the whole taxonomy that he has been developing, but we're certainly also not at the end of the road yet when it comes to asking ourselves what actually is bias, how do we define it, and what are all the sub-concepts that play a part of this. And research is very scattered when it comes to bias. Everybody is kind of making their own definitions and putting them out there, but kind of unifying this will, as Timo already also mentioned, really be crucial in also bringing the field forward, because having a concrete idea of what bias is so fundamental to actually being able to detect it. Otherwise, it's basically poking in the dark because we don't even know what we are trying to detect. So basically working on definitions and also trying to better understand, okay, what actually is the concept of media bias is definitely also going to take a major role in the future. Something that we might not have talked yet so much about today is the users. So also there, of course, this is more indirectly connected to the detection of media bias, but ultimately we don't want to do this detection also just for the sake of it. We also want to understand, okay, how do actually users interact, for example, with us presenting them, for example, labels of an automatic detection system, or how do actually different users also have their own maybe cognitive bias towards the news that they are presented, that we cannot identify solely based out of the text. Then we have the models where there's still a lot of research opportunities out there, be it on the performance, be it on the robustness of models. So far, Timo has mainly talked about performance of models, but something that we also saw over the last years, I think, is that performance is the one side of the coin, but we also have to see that these models are also generalizing. And so I will also touch a little bit on a project on robustness. And last of all, also the news is, I think, a lot more complex in its landscape than we have tackled it so far. Timo has mentioned that we mainly come from analyzing text, basically, but also understanding how do images come into play, how does video in news come into play, how does the environments that news are presented by, so for example, social media and so on and so forth. What role they will play is also, I think, a super interesting research field. So these are just a couple of points that I wanted to mention. So briefly, because I wanted to use the opportunity to also touch upon a couple of projects that were just finished or that are currently ongoing. I think something that we have to consider when we are thinking about models to automatically detect media bias is that something that we see is that these models sometimes make life easy for themselves by basically having spurious cues while training, so that they're basically reliant on, for example, names or concept that we would not inherently associate to be bias, but that they just find as good ways to achieve good performance on media bias annotated data sets. So this is something that we, for example, saw a lot, that when we changed individual words, that then also classification changed a lot. I think there is definitely some reliance on spurious cues out there that we also found. So basically models heavily relying on individual words or individual names, that if you, for example, and we did like a checklist-based tests on this. So if you, for example, change the gender association in individual sentences in a text, and then you ask the model, this actually changes their bias classification behavior, and kind of making the models more robust, and finding ways of making models more robust. This is also currently something that we are investigating. I mean, one way is, of course, having a more diverse and having a better or bigger data set available to train upon. I mean, this is usually the solution to these problems, but there's also other training strategies that one can employ when finding new data sets is incredibly difficult and also expensive, as it is with media bias data sets. All right, then something I thought that would also be interesting, because it's like a little bit of a different area, is also thinking about like user research and UX research. So a study that a colleague of ours was doing primarily is that she built a platform to actually ask users on their opinion and on whether something is biased or not. So basically putting the human in the loop, but also user testing. Okay, how can we actually present our results to users, and basically what is a preferred way of presenting these results? As you can imagine, if one wants to go bring this basically out in the world, these classifier, this is, I think, an important question to ask yourself. How can actually users understand the results of these models, and how can they actually also perceive it in a way that it is somewhat contributing to their media literacy? Talking about users understanding the outputs of models. I mean, there's a new train in town as well, right? I mean, a lot of research that we have done was mainly based on classifiers that could have been binary. Maybe there was a score associated, or maybe the individual words were pointed out um, on where the bias is lying. But something that, I mean, with the rise of the language models that we're all using right now, is that we just have the opportunity to also actually go into explaining bias, right? And I think for bias detection, this is a game changer, because previously, if you would ask somebody, okay, there's an article and here's the label, it's associated not biased, then the person will be like, okay, hey, but maybe I disagree with it, or I don't understand why that is the case, or I don't understand why there should be bias in this article. But now we actually have the opportunity to let the models explain why there is bias in the article. And this has the opportunity to actually be a lot more convincing, and with this, a lot more useful in its annotation. But of course, there's also a lot of questions that come associated with it. For example, what makes a good explanations? Are these models actually generating good explanations? How can you basically get the best explanations, and so on and so forth? So this is something that we're also currently working on to basically use these new capabilities. Then I think another interesting factor to consider is basically different media formats. So something that I'm also currently working on is looking at also the German film or the German television landscape, and also looking at, okay, how can different news formats can also be annotated, maybe also with the capability that we already have. Maybe how can it has to be different, but also seeing, okay, can we take these learnings that we just had in basically written news text also to other formats? And with this outlook, hopefully on time to also let you ask questions and let us start a little bit of a discussion. Timo, of course, already mentioned it. I've also already wrote it in the chat. But basically, how to get in touch, that is pretty easy. Write us an email, check out our research on mediabiasresearch.org, or yeah, just reach out to us. We're always happy to collaborate. And as you've hopefully seen on the last couple of slides, there's so many topics to basically work upon. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I don't know what the plan is, but as we thought we do 45 minutes of presentation and then we do questions. So if anybody wants to comment, has questions, I think now is your chance.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. And Talia, do we have any questions in the audience?
Hi. I don't think there's a raise hand button. Can I ask a question unless there's someone else has something urgent? I'm Sir Huang, so let me just open my video. Yeah. I'm also, it's more about a thought. So for example, we analyze social media. It's not a criticism, but I feel that the word bias is very difficult. Different people, if I'm brought up like this and then I think you are wrong, and then if you have different environment. So, and also I'm very worried about you asking the user to mark on the on a portal to think whether they think it's biased or not. I mean, how do you know that they are not biased? And then their answer will be biased. So my research just now, in fact, I just submitted a request. I sent you an email to request joining your network, like maybe your seminar list. So at this moment, I'm looking at framing, like let's say left wing, right wing, and then climate. So for example, just very, very basic, the most contrasting will be emphasis framing and also equivalence framing. Is this person talking about an issue and forgetting about everything else? Or this person is more neutral? So what the other thing about my feeling is instead of using the word bias, it's about the issue, how many contrasting issues here. So maybe if you have a bias, maybe it's 0 to 1 is continuum rather than binary. I don't know what you think about it. Yeah, do you know what I mean? And also the framing, then especially if you have very complicated things, let's say climate change, and then there's a job issues, there's some other maybe uncertainty about new technology, and then I don't know. I think you probably understand what I'm trying to present here. Yeah.
Martin, or like any of us, but I think we both agree on everything. Like bias is a very difficult term. Not even only in the terms that you mentioned, because it is very subjective, but also even the term bias in other ways. I mean, like algorithmic bias and statistical bias. Like we came across so many I don't know, like how to say it, like accidental interchangements of words and unclear definitions. So this is a big issue. And yes, like I would even go one further than you, because not only is the bias difficult in classifying bias or the subjectivity, but also it is difficult when creating a bias taxonomy. And like there's no final truth about this, most likely. So yeah, I would say we are trying to define it as clearly as possible. And in the future, there will also be workshops. We are studying a project about doing this taxonomy more clearly, because I think this is the solution to the problem. But it will take a long time. There's so many definitions, there's a lot of subjectivity, there's different interpretations, and like it needs global consensus on some resource, which has to be facilitated by a platform even. And like this is difficult. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I think my point here is that there's not going to ever going to be a consensus. There's not ever going to be an answer. As I say, I'm not trying to overrule you. So at this moment, I was thinking about, instead of thinking about who is right, who is wrong, at this moment, I was trying to analyze like how will this kind of bias or framing lead to certain outcome and decision, like maybe some riots or maybe election result. How do they start to manipulate the discussion? But anyway, I think I contribute quite a lot. There's some other people asking question. Yeah.
I wanted to say a brief word on your initial question or initial comment on basically in the platform. How do you not know that the people that you're asking are not biased? And I mean, this is a fundamental question, I think, that you can always ask when you let humans annotate for bias. And you're never really going to get around this. I think something that we were striving for a little bit with this platform was to get somewhat of a societal, or to understand somewhat of a societal consensus on what is perceived by a larger amount of people as to be biased. This does not mean that this is then objective to any sort of definition, but I think often bias understanding underlies some societal agreements that we somewhat have for this to exist. And I think this is a way to somewhat make this a little bit more apparent. But I agree with you, like this question of how do you not know that they're also not biased, and they are not biased. I mean, the question is, we all are biased to a certain extent, so that we'll never really get around this with manual annotations. Yeah.
Well, we have minimum 2 more questions. So I think that the first one who raised a hand was a TB931382. Sorry, I don't see another name. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, my name is Alan. I think capture my identification from my university. My question is more, do you see this bias detection being used also for images? Because there is a lot of generation of images as well, in particular that's very popular in political domain, when you are generating some kind of meme or some kind of image that's trying to express some, and usually this meme, this image, they also has some bias. Of course, I imagine that to do this, you need to use some image recognition to text as well, to use yours. But do you think that seems viable as well? I'm asking this in order to try to go in more direction in some kind of multimodal classification, not only a text-based classification. Thank you.
Martin, if you like to, I'm just answering the question in the chat. So please go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, so I think probably it's possible, right? If you if you basically already transfer them into text, then you can already probably with our models already try and classify whether there's bias there. We have not really looked into this. I mean, it sounds to me like this very much also in the social media range, where I think language is also vastly different and less in this realm of subtlety. And more into maybe also more like hate speech and really fake news categories. So this is not something that we have looked into in projects. But I think, I mean, building models that could do both does not sound impossible to me.
Well, I will have one more question, raised hand, Farhana Lisa. Would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Timo and Martin, for your presentation. It was excellent. And it's the initiative is, I think, is very timely because this media virus is causing a lot of troubles all around the world. I have one question, and I would send you request in the link you shared to be part of it. But my question is the data set you mentioned, like crowdsourcing and labeling. So is it like a particular media you targeted, or you collected data from all over how did that work?
Maybe a question for you, Timo, that you were in the dataset design.
Yeah, actually, there are two questions, right? So the first one is like you have to think about it, right? The first one is like sorry, what was it? You said two questions. What was the first
Yeah.
first question? Sorry.
My first question is, when you collected the data, how did you select the source to be collected the data from? Yeah, that's my first question. Maybe.
Yeah, that was more like what was similar to what was asked in the chat and like the answer that I just sent. So it definitely has a big impact. Like, but we don't know exactly which. And so like when we selected the sources for our data set, we tried to balance them so that we find more controversial, less controversial, less known, more involved topics, and just try to do it balanced. But it's really difficult to see what impact exactly the diversity of the underlying data set has on the final result. And this is even something that's not unique for media bias. Like we came across quite a bunch of people who work on LLM diversity and like annotation diversity, and this is even related also to what I'm sorry if I pronounced the name wrong, what Seo Huang said before, because yeah, the more diverse it is, the better you will be able to find differences and like see whether different topics and different ideologies might have an impact on the final result. if annotated by very different people. And then like just trying to balance it out as much as possible is something which is very expensive, but ideally a good idea.
Okay, so maybe I'll reiterate my question. So or I'll give an example. So is it something like if I want to see if BBC, that the broadcasting media in UK, if I want to see if BBC is biased or not, I need data from BBC News, right? So what I'm asking is this data has some particular sources of information you collected, or how did you select those sources?
Well, I mean, I think what you're referring to is like which sources would you select if you want to assess the bias in an entire medium as a whole, and like which is something that we haven't done. So and I would say this is also a tough question. Like the platform All Sides from the US, and all Ad Fontes as well. I will write the names in the chat. They kind of do this. Like they look at outlets and they try to assess from looking at as many articles as possible with experts and automatic classifications whether these outlets exhibit some sort of ideology and how. And like so this is something that they do that we do less. I would say for us, we're still one step before that even, because we are trying to really understand in detail what bias is even. And then only once we know that, basically, we would go ahead and look at the entire news outlet.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
I think maybe to add, I think a lot of the platforms that currently also do this, they're also focused basically usually on one subconcept. Usually it's political bias, and then they would analyze all articles for like a left or right, like leaning, and then make a sum. I mean, one could potentially think of also doing or creating these kind of metrics for like a combination of sub-concepts of bias. But this might take us a couple more years, I think.
Maybe I will also briefly answer towards the questions in the chat. So, like if we were to extend research to other languages, like it would be very interesting to see whether this taxonomy needs to be changed. Like we're right now applying for fundings here and there. We're trying to grow the research group to get more PhD students involved so that we can investigate questions like these. Because like if you auto translate a data set and a classifier and the information and the taxonomy, like I'm quite sure that culturally interpretations of different types of bias will differ just because they're more common or not. And in some languages or some societies, even it's more common to use strong wording, and in others it's less common. And so yeah. So basically, this is something that has to be investigated a lot. And the second question is closely related to it. I would say, as Media Bias Group, we have done quite the roller coaster. Like we started as a research network of just people who are passionate about the network, and and then we found more people, and we also found people who were like looking for guidance to be more directed towards what to do about media bias. And they joined the network, and sooner than we thought, we became like an actual group, less than a network. And we didn't even know that happened. And alongside this process, we also talked to industry partners, because it wasn't always clear how we are able to fund ourselves and whether we are able to grow this project. And so we started talking to industry partners to assess, like, hey, if we cannot continue this road, is there a way to fund ourselves over the business side? And so we talked to hundreds of companies, and we got a lot of feedback from all possible directions. But I think one major insight from that was that that there is a market to like perform this kind of narrative analysis for companies. They are looking for it. They want to understand their audience better. But at the same time, after a lot of struggles, I think we kind of by accident, at least so far, went more into the direction of research, because we felt that there's so much to do, really. Like we haven't even understood anything about it. And these questions here, they also show this. like because it's such a general problem, and there need to be hundreds of studies on it to understand like what we can do. Like how do we increase awareness on a global scale? Like which game or like teaching material do we need to bring into schools so that we can actually become more aware of media bias and make more educated decisions? And for sure, this only affects a small part of the population as well, because some people just don't care. And like this is a really big area. And so I would say there is a market in the risk domain as well as in the performance and content marketing domain. But yeah, I think like what we are trying to do is become like the knowledge hub for media bias. So we are related to this, but we are more and more we are finding our way, I would say. And pretty much this.
I mean, that sounds like great closing words to me almost. I only wanted to briefly answer to Favtsiva, sorry, I'm probably butchering the names today, is a question about postdoc applications and collaborations. I mean, we're always open for collaborations. This is something we definitely strive towards too. It's like we're not a fixed institute or one university department that has like open positions opening. So it's always kind of everybody is very much segregated throughout the world, or not segregated, but like everybody is at different positions or different also financing grounds. I mean, let's talk. Sure that we can maybe find a collaboration opportunity.
Oh,
Yeah,
thanks,
and we're
Martin.
and like I guess we are going towards this, right? I mean, right now we are applying for grants so that we can start to create positions, and we are bringing in money to start the group differently. Like as I said, so far it was usually thought as a network, and like time after time, it's more becoming an actual group with like applying for fundings. But these processes are slow, and like it takes years, I would say, is in the research domain to build up this kind of thing. And I don't know. I guess I would describe it as a research startup, which is a little bit weird, but
No,
maybe
I
this
think
is
it's fantastic. You got to start somewhere. Like if anybody follows Star Wars, there is no rebellion without hope. So go
and
for
like
it.
for example, since you're finishing the PhD, one thing that is going on right now, for example, like years ago, we got to know a very interesting computer science student, and she wanted to work with us all the while, and we always stayed in touch because we couldn't offer any funding. She did her PhD in Norway now, and like she's still interested in working with us. So now that she's finishing the PhD, she's applying for her own postdoc funding to come with us to Japan in the coming year, because we're taking the whole group to Japan. We're like 10 people. We're going to go to Tokyo. Yeah, so she's basically right now we are at this point where we're like we don't have these positions yet to hire. So like she was like, what if I just get my own funding? You support me, you help me write the application, and
Yeah,
like and we will work together. And this is what we're doing with her. So this is kind of the state of where we're at.
yeah, maybe well, my supervisor said that we will be writing grants when I finish, but there's just so much that can be done. Like you're talking about Japan. Like I am from Pakistan, and I live now in the UK for the last 15, 20 years. So oh my God, there is so much that can be covered in the East as well. This has so many avenues. It's fantastic. That's why I could go fintech, I could go anywhere. I've been in computer science for ages, but I believe in, it's a personal ethos. So I went towards hate speech, and I love what I'm doing. But it's something like this where you're actually dealing with media bias and all of that needs more people, you know.
Agreed.
It,
Yeah, that's the point, right? And like I think if we
it's
could
it
choose, if we could choose, we would love to get like some big foundation giving us 5 million to hire
yeah,
people and create
but
a group.
sadly,
But we are
no
not
one.
there yet. Maybe someday.
Yeah, sadly, the people with the money have another agenda, and that's the sad bit.
Oh, I don't
But
know. I
but
think it's
we can
possible
all still
actually.
keep striving. We can all, as long as there's a few of us that have belief, then we'll get there. So thank you.
True.
This was a really good. And yep, I've sent my follow on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. No, thank you. Thank you.
Well, we are already running of time a bit. I just wanted to ask, if you don't mind, we have still one question in the chat that we did not consider before. Do you please maybe have a couple of minutes to answer it? From Elena Musi, could you elaborate on fake news as one of the media categories? To my understanding, media bias can lead to disinformation. Some of the categories look overlapping, linguistic features and framing. How did you come up with the taxonomy?
So yeah, I will try to answer it in short. Yes, the taxonomy is not finished. This was just a first status. The categories are overlapping, which is not good. We are working on a second version right now. The first one was really basically made based on like collecting as many definitions as possible and then like writing it together qualitatively. But yeah, it's not good enough. So we are making a second
Maybe one add to
version.
this.
Please.
I think in the taxonomy also, the categories have to overlap sometimes, because they're very different concepts in there. So some are basically about how is bias induced. So is it, for example, Timo talked about linguistic bias or the context, and others are about basically more of a content approach to it, right? So for example, who is affected by the bias? So for example, in gender bias. And naturally, this bias is always induced maybe through linguistic bias or through context bias. So an overlap in the way that the taxonomy is built currently is also something that kind of has to be there, just because it's also different concepts that are playing into it.
Yeah. Like I think actually I see now that I think Elena isn't here anymore, is she?
No, she's not here anymore. So yeah,
Like I think the
we
person who
have to
asked the
carry this
question
answer to her.
But yeah, so like the fake news question is fake news and bias is somewhat related, but we don't know exactly how. So it's not the same though, because it's like made up content versus presentation analysis. But it's related for sure, strongly.
I would like to say thank you very much for our incredible speakers, and thank you very much for our attendees for the very, very fruitful discussion. And I think it was very interesting. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
see
having
you.
us.
Yes, thank you very much, and hope see you on our next seminars. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye. Take care.
All right, so I guess we also just gotta go, right?
Yes, thank you so much. I think it was really very interesting, and it I think that you had so many questions from the audience. Usually we don't have so many questions, to say honestly. So your talk was really very popular.
Thank you. Could have spent half an hour more answering questions, I think. But
Well,
that's
I
great.
think that maybe they will ask them later, because people wrote that they sent you messages in LinkedIn. So I think that this discussion may continue further.
And then
Nice,
thank you
thank you.
again for having us, and have a great afternoon or evening.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much, and have a nice evening.